The history books remember him as the man who lost America. They remember him as the Mad King who spoke to trees and foamed at the mouth. But before the madness, before the chains, and before the isolation of Windsor Castle, there was a man who gloried in the name of Britain. George III was a king of duty, a man of science, and a devoted husband who broke the royal tradition of mistresses to remain faithful to his queen, Charlotte. For 28 years, his reign was a model of Enlightenment stability. But in the summer of 1788, the golden age of George III began to fracture. It didn't start with a scream or a delusion. It started with a simple stomachache. Imagine being the most powerful man on earth, yet becoming a prisoner in your own skin. What if the very doctors sworn to save you were actually the ones torturing you? And what if the madness that cost him his crown wasn't disease of the mind at all, but a poison hiding in his very blood? Today, we peel back the velvet curtains of the royal mansion to witness the beginning of a tragedy that would change the British monarchy forever. George III was a man of habit. He rose at the same time, ate simple meals, and obsessed over the smallest details of statecraft. He was Farmer George, a monarch who loved the soil of England more than the gold of the treasury. By 1788, he had already faced the devastating loss of the American colonies, a blow that many historians believe planted the first seeds of his mental fragility. He was 50 years old, an age where a monarch should be at the peak of his wisdom. Instead, he was about to descend into a darkness that no candle in the royal palace could light. June 1788. The first symptoms were deceptive. In June, the king complained of a bilious attack, severe abdominal pain, and a heavy, leaden feeling in his limbs. His primary physician, Sir George Baker, attributed it to the king's habit of walking in the rain and wearing wet stockings. It seemed trivial. The king was sent to Cheltenham to take the waters, a common 18th century remedy. For a few weeks, the fresh air and mineral springs seemed to work. The king was jovial, greeting his subjects with his signature. What? A verbal tic that showed his restless, energetic mind. But beneath the surface, something was brewing. The pain in his stomach returned, sharper this time, like a knife twisting in his gut. By October 1788, the king returned to Windsor, but he was not the same man. The silence of the palace was now broken by the sound of the king's voice. Non-stop, hour after hour, he began to talk with a terrifying volubility, sometimes speaking for 19 hours without a break until his voice grew hoarse and his mouth foamed. One evening, during a dinner that would go down in royal infamy, the king's mental threads finally snapped. In front of his horrified wife and daughters, George III suddenly flew into a rage. He grabbed his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, by the collar and slammed him against the wall. The prince, a man known for his vanity and strained relationship with his father, broke into tears. The secret could no longer be kept. The King of Great Britain was losing his mind. In 1788, the word psychiatry didn't exist. To the doctors of the Georgian era, madness was either a moral failing or an imbalance of humors. They saw the king's yellowing eyes, his dark, port wine-colored urine, and his skin rashes, but they couldn't connect the dots. Modern science looks back at George III with a different lens. For decades, the leading theory was porphyria, a rare genetic blood disorder that can cause abdominal agony, limb weakness, and profound hallucinations. Others argue it was a severe case of bipolar disorder, triggered by the immense stress of his position. But for George, the diagnosis didn't matter. What mattered was the cure. As the sun set over Windsor in the winter of 1788, the king was no longer a sovereign. He was a patient, and the mad business, as it was called, was about to begin. The king had once written that he wished he might die, for he feared he was going mad. His wish was not granted. Instead, he was moved to the secluded White House at Kew, away from the public eye, where the true horror was about to unfold. In our next part, we go inside the locked rooms of Kew Palace, where the king's doctors, men of science and men of cruelty, begin a treatment that would be considered torture today. In the winter of 1788, the majesty of the British crown was stripped away, replaced by the cold, damp stone of Kew Palace. To the public, the king was indisposed. To the politicians in London, he was a constitutional crisis. But to the man himself, George William Frederick, He was a soul trapped in a house of horrors. The royal mansion, once a symbol of Enlightenment elegance, had become a prison, and the men walking its halls weren't courtiers or friends. They were the mad doctors. In the 18th century, the treatment for insanity was not comfort. It was submission. What happens when a king of the most powerful empire on earth is forced to his knees by men he would usually never even deign to speak to? We often think of royal medicine as the pinnacle of care, but for George III, it was a descent into a medieval nightmare. Blisters, gags, and the dreaded strait waistcoat were the tools of a trade. But was this medicine, or was it a desperate attempt to break a king who refused to be silent? The transition from Windsor to Kew Palace was done under the cover of darkness. The king did not want to go. He sensed that leaving Windsor meant leaving his dignity behind. He reportedly wept, clutching the doorposts, as he was ushered into a carriage. Kew was chosen for its isolation. It was a smaller, more private residence where the king's shameful condition could be hidden from the prying eyes of the London press. But Kew was unheated. The rooms were sparsely furnished, and the atmosphere was thick with the scent of dampness and despair. Here, the king was no longer addressed as Your Majesty. He was a patient to be managed. The rise of the mad doctors, the primary physicians, led by Sir George Baker and Richard Warren, were out of their depth. They were traditionalists who believed the king's madness was caused by morbid humors rising to the brain. Their solution? To physically purge the madness out of him. The treatments were agonizing. To draw the heat from his head, they applied blistering plasters, caustic Spanish fly ointment, to his legs and forehead. This caused massive, painful chemical burns and open sores that were intentionally kept from healing to drain the toxins. Imagine the King of England, hobbling on raw, infected feet, unable to find a moment's rest from the stinging fire on his skin. When the king became agitated, which he often did, as anyone would under such torture, the doctors resorted to the strait waistcoat. This was a heavy linen garment with sleeves that wrapped around the torso, pinning the king's arms to his chest. He was often strapped into a correction chair, a heavy wooden throne where his head and limbs were immobilized for hours. Despite the physical degradation, George III's spirit flickered. He knew he was being mistreated. He once looked at his doctors and remarked with a haunting clarity, "I am a poor, miserable man, but I have a soul that will live forever." His madness manifested in strange, heartbreaking ways. He would talk to the wallpaper as if it were a long-lost friend. He would play the harpsichord until his fingers bled. Most famously, he was seen talking to an oak tree in Windsor Great Park, allegedly believing it was the King of Prussia. But were these the actions of a lunatic or the desperate coping mechanisms of a man whose brain was being ravaged by porphyria? Modern medicine suggests that the king wasn't just hallucinating. He was experiencing peripheral neuropathy, a condition where the nerves feel like they are on fire. His constant talking was likely an attempt to distract himself from the excruciating pain in his limbs and stomach. As the king's condition worsened, the queen and the government became desperate. They turned to a man named Dr. Francis Willis. Willis was not a high society physician. He ran a private asylum in Lincolnshire. His methods were controversial. He believed in moral management, a mix of psychological intimidation and reward. Willis arrived at Kew with his sons and a crew of assistants who were essentially physical enforcers. To Willis, the king was like a wild animal that needed to be tamed. He looked the king in the eye, an act of treason for anyone else, and told him plainly that if he did not behave, he would be restrained. The battle of wills between the king and the mad doctor had begun. The Prince of Wales watched from the sidelines, already measuring the crown for his own head. While the king screamed in his straitjacket at Kew, the foundations of the British government were shaking. Was the king truly gone, or was there still a man inside that tortured body waiting to reclaim his throne? While King George III was being blistered and bound at Kew Palace, a different kind of fever was taking hold in London. It was a fever of ambition. In the 18th century, a king who could not rule was a vacuum, and nature, especially political nature, abhors a vacuum. As the king's mind fractured, the pillars of the British government began to shake. The tragedy of George III wasn't just a medical horror. It was a constitutional nightmare. At the center of this storm was a son who had spent his life waiting for his father to fail. Could a son truly be happy to see his father go mad? For George, the Prince of Wales, his father's insanity wasn't a tragedy. It was an opportunity. While the king was strapped to a chair, his heir was measuring the throne. But between the prince and the crown stood one man, William Pitt the Younger, a prime minister who knew that if the king fell, he would fall with him. This wasn't just a family quarrel. It was a cold-blooded battle for the soul of an empire. The Prince of Wales, the rising sun, George Augustus Frederick, the Prince of Wales, was the polar opposite of his father. Where the king was frugal, the prince was a spendthrift. Where the king was faithful, the prince was a womanizer. They loathed each other. The king saw his son as a lazy, debauched shadow of a man. The prince saw his father as a tyrannical boor. When the news of the king's total derangement reached Carlton House, the prince didn't mourn. He threw a dinner party. He began to act as if the crown were already his, surrounding himself with the Whig opposition. Men like Charles James Fox, who promised him absolute power if he became regent. Britain faced a terrifying question. Who has the right to declare a king unfit? The Parliament was split down the middle. The Whigs argued that the Prince of Wales had an inherent, divine right to take over the government immediately. The Tories, led by the brilliant 29-year-old Prime Minister William Pitt, disagreed. Pitt knew that if the prince became regent with full powers, Pitt himself would be fired within the hour. Pitt played for time. He insisted that Parliament, and only Parliament, had the right to appoint a regent and define his powers. This led to months of vicious debate, while the king remained locked away, unaware that his very existence had become a political chess piece. Inside the mansion, Queen Charlotte was caught in a crossfire of loyalty and fear. She was terrified of her husband's outbursts, but she was equally terrified of her son's ambition. The Prince of Wales had even tried to suggest that the Queen was also losing her mind, hoping to shove her aside, so he controlled the king's person and his household. The relationship between mother and son disintegrated. Charlotte refused to let the prince see his father without witnesses, fearing it would provoke the king into a fit just to prove he was still mad. The hallways of the royal residences became a battlefield of spies, with doctors reporting to Pitt and servants reporting to the prince. In December 1788, the House of Commons called the king's doctors to testify. It was a public humiliation for the monarchy. Every detail of the king's illness, his foaming at the mouth, his incoherent rambling, his physical violence, was read into the record. The Whigs pushed the doctors to say the king was incurable. The Tories pushed him to say he was just temporarily indisposed. Dr. Willis, the man who treated the king like a wild animal, became the star witness. He boldly claimed he could cure the king through his moral management. It was a gamble that gave Pitt the time he needed. By early 1789, Pitt had successfully passed a regency bill through the Commons, but it was a clipped regency. The prince would have a title, but he wouldn't be allowed to grant peerages, sell land, or touch the king's personal property. The prince was furious, but he had no choice. The pen was hovering over the final signature. The Prince of Wales was seconds away from becoming the de facto king of England. But then, something happened that no one, not the prince, not the Whigs, and not even the doctors, expected. Just as the regency bill reached the House of Lords, a bulletin arrived from Kew Palace. The king, who had been screaming at the moon for months, had suddenly asked for his shaving kit. He was calm. He was coherent. The mad king was waking up, and his recovery would be the greatest disappointment of his son's life. In February 1789, the corridors of Kew Palace, once filled with the echoes of royal screams and the scuffling of attendants, fell into a sudden, eerie silence. The mad doctor, Francis Willis, stood by the window, watching his patient. For months, the king had been a whirlwind of chaos. Now, he was sitting at a table, calmly reading a book. The Regency Bill, the document that would have stripped George III of his power and handed it to his predatory son, was sitting on a desk in the House of Lords, waiting for a final signature. But the king had other plans. He was waking up from a nightmare, seemingly restored to the man he once was. How does a man go from speaking to trees and foaming at the mouth to discussing complex statecraft in the span of a few days? Was it the brutal treatments of the doctors that cured him, or was it simply the natural ebb and flow of a biological poison? As London prepared for the grandest celebration in its history, a dark question remained. If the madness could leave as quickly as it arrived, when would it come back to claim him again? The recovery was as sudden as a descent. On February 10th, the king's volubility, that endless, terrifying stream of speech, subsided. He asked after the queen. He asked for his favorite clock to be brought to him so he could wind it. To the doctors, this was a miracle. To Dr. Willis, it was a personal victory for his moral management system. By February 19th, the bulletins issued to the public changed their tone entirely. They no longer spoke of disturbed nights, but of progressive amendment. The king was allowed to see his prime minister, William Pitt. The meeting was tense. Pitt expected a broken man. Instead, he found a king who was sharp, grateful, and, most importantly, fully aware of the political treachery his son had attempted in his absence. During this recovery, the king's physical symptoms also vanished. The abdominal cramps stopped. The skin rashes cleared. And, most tellingly, the king's urine, which had been described by his apothecaries as a deep, dark port wine color, returned to normal. This detail is the smoking gun for modern historians. This discoloration is a classic symptom of porphyria, a metabolic disorder where the body fails to produce heme, the oxygen-carrying part of the blood. The buildup of porphyrins acts as a neurotoxin, attacking the nervous system and the brain. It explains the physical pain, the madness, and the sudden recovery. George wasn't losing his mind. His blood was poisoning his brain. In London, the Prince of Wales and his Whig allies were in a state of shock. They had been days away from total power. Now, they were seen as vultures who had tried to steal a living man's crown. The prince attempted to visit his father at Kew, hoping to play the part of a concerned son. The meeting was cold. The king, though physically frail, looked at his heir with a new, piercing clarity. He knew that while he was being strapped into a chair, his son was picking out new furniture for the throne room. The regency bill was dropped. The rising son of the Prince of Wales had been eclipsed by the stubborn survival of his father. On April 23rd, 1789, London witnessed a spectacle unlike any other. It was a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral. The king rode through the streets in a gold carriage, surrounded by thousands of cheering subjects. There were illuminations in every window. The people truly loved Farmer George. As the king sat under the great dome of St. Paul's, listening to the choir, he wept. They were tears of gratitude, but perhaps also tears of fear. He had been to the edge of the abyss and looked in. He knew the fragility of his own consciousness. The king returned to his duties. He signed papers. He reviewed the troops, and he walked in his gardens. To the world, the king's malady was a one-time fluke, a temporary fever brought on by cold weather or stress. But inside the royal mansion, the doctors stayed close. Dr. Willis was kept on a generous pension, always lurking in the shadows. The queen remained anxious, jumping at every loud noise or rapid sentence the king uttered. The peace was restored, but it was a fragile peace. The madness wasn't gone. It was merely hibernating. For 12 years, the king would remain sane. He would lead Britain through the early stages of the war against Napoleon, but the biological clock was ticking. In 1801, the port wine shadow would return, and this time, the king would realize that his mansion was not just a home, but a waiting room for a final, permanent exile. For 12 years, the British Empire breathed a sigh of relief. The king was back. He was a father of the people, the steady hand guiding the nation to the terrifying wake of the French Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte was rising in the East, and England needed its king to be a pillar of granite. George III played the part perfectly. He was diligent, he was present, and he was sane. But inside the royal mansion, the air was never truly clear. Queen Charlotte lived in a state of perpetual hypervigilance. She watched the way he ate. She listened to the cadence of his voice in the dead of night. She knew that the monster wasn't dead. It was simply sleeping. In February 1801, the king went for a walk in a cold, biting wind. He returned with chill, a slight fever, and a familiar, localized pain in his joints. The nightmare was back, and this time it wouldn't just break the king. It would break the heart of the woman who loved him most. What happens to a marriage when your partner becomes a stranger overnight? Queen Charlotte had stood by George through the first wave of madness, but the 1801 relapse changed the fundamental chemistry of their relationship. As the king's mind fractured again, he began to turn on the one person who had been his anchor. Why did the man who once famously refused to take a mistress suddenly find his wife repulsive? And how did a dispute over Catholic rights in Ireland trigger a biological collapse that no doctor could stop? History often looks at George III's madness as a purely biological event, but in 1801, it was catalyzed by a massive political betrayal. Prime Minister William Pitt, the man who had saved the king's throne during the first crisis, proposed Catholic emancipation. He wanted to give Catholics the right to sit in Parliament to stabilize the newly formed United Kingdom. To George III, this was a violation of his coronation oath. He believed that if he signed the bill, he would be a heretic in the eyes of God. The stress was catastrophic. He famously told his friends, "I shall go mad," as the pressure from Pitt mounted. His prophecy was self-fulfilling. The mental strain triggered a massive porphyria flare-up. The physical pain returned, and with it, the delirium that turned the halls of the palace into a gallery of ghosts. During the first bout of illness in 1788, Queen Charlotte was the king's protector. By 1801, she was a woman exhausted by years of anxiety. When the king relapsed, his personality shifted into something darker. He became verbally abusive toward Charlotte. He accused her of being part of a conspiracy to keep him imprisoned. Most heartbreakingly, the king, who had been the most devoted husband in royal history, began to fixate on other women, specifically Lady Elizabeth Pembroke. He would talk for hours about his true wife, leaving Charlotte humiliated and terrified. The queen, fearing for her physical safety, began to sleep in a separate bedroom, locked behind a series of heavy doors. The domestic intimacy that had defined their reign was extinguished forever. The government didn't hesitate this time. They knew the drill. The mad doctors, the Willis family, were summoned back to Mansion. But there was a difference now. The king remembered them. He remembered the straitjackets. He remembered the blistering. When Dr. Thomas Willis, the son of Francis, arrived, the king flew into a rage. He tried to physically resist, but he was a man in his 60s now, weakened by the very disease that made him violent. The Willis boys were younger and stronger. They forced the king into the correction chair and applied the same brutal methods as before. The royal mansion, which should have been a place of healing, once again echoed with the sounds of a king being broken like a wild horse. While the king was being restrained, the palace fell into a somber, fearful silence. The king's daughters, the princesses, were trapped in a nunnery of their father's making. He was so protective of them that he refused to let them marry, fearing that any change to the family dynamic would shatter his fragile mind. They spent their days crying in the music room, listening to their father's muffled shouts from the floor above. The 1801 relapse was shorter than the first, lasting only a few months, but the damage was deeper. When the king eventually recovered, the trust between him and the queen was gone. Charlotte remained terrified of him, and the king remained suspicious of her. They lived under the same roof, but they were miles apart. The Prince of Wales, seeing his father stumble again, immediately began lobbying for power. This time, however, the king's recovery was faster, and the prince was once again shoved back into the shadows. But the world saw the truth. The King of England was a repeating lunatic. The stability of the British crown was now a house of cards, waiting for the next gust of wind to blow it down. The king was back on his throne by the summer of 1801, but the man who emerged was a ghost of his former self. He began to lose his eyesight. The world was literally and figuratively dimming. He had survived the second storm, but the third one, the one that would swallow him whole, was already gathering on the horizon. By 1810, the King of England was a man living in a world of shadows. The physical world had betrayed him first. His eyes, once sharp enough to spot a misplaced button on a soldier's uniform, were now clouded by cataracts. He was almost totally blind. He moved through the royal mansion by touch, his hands grazing the familiar mahogany of the furniture, his ears tuned to the floorboards he had walked for 50 years. But the darkness outside was nothing compared to the darkness gathering within. The madness was no longer a visitor. It was becoming a permanent resident. And it took the death of his favorite child, the youngest, the brightest, and the most tragic, to finally push George III over the edge into a void from which he would never return. They say grief can break a sane man, So what does it do to a man whose mind is already held together by frayed threads? Princess Amelia was a king's precious treasure, the child of his old age. As she lay dying of a slow, agonizing infection, the king sat by her bed, unable to see her face, but feeling her life slip away through her fingertips. When she died, she left him a parting gift, a ring that would become the key to his final, permanent collapse. Why did a simple piece of jewelry trigger the end of an era? George III was an obsessively protective father. He viewed his daughters not as independent women, but as extensions of his own heartbeat. He refused to let them marry, fearing that the stress of their departure would trigger his porphyria. The princesses, Augusta, Elizabeth, Mary, Sophia, and Amelia, lived in what they called a nunnery. Amelia, the youngest, was the rebel. She had secretly fallen in love with a royal equerry, Charles Fitzroy. She dreamed of life outside the suffocating walls of the mansion, but her body failed her. She contracted tuberculosis of a knee, and by 1810, at just 27 years old, she was dying. The king visited Amelia every day. Because he was blind, he would sit by her bed and hold her hand, listening to her labored breathing. He prayed for a miracle, but his prayers were answered with silence. Amelia, knowing her end was near, commissioned a special mourning ring for her father. It contained a lock of her hair and the inscription, "Remember me." When she placed that ring on his finger in October 1810, the weight of it was too much for the king to bear. The realization that his precious treasure was leaving him shattered the last remnants of his mental defenses. Amelia died on November 2nd. The king did not attend the funeral. He couldn't. He was already gone. The grief triggered a massive, violent flare-up of his condition. This wasn't like 1788 or 1801. This was a total system failure. The king began to talk to dead people, his long-deceased ancestors, and most heartbreakingly, to Amelia herself. He believed she was still alive, just away in Hanover, living in a world where she was healthy and happy. The doctors were summoned, but this time, even the Willis boys couldn't tame him. The king's volubility returned with a vengeance. He spoke for 58 hours without stopping. He played the harpsichord with a frantic, dissonant energy, claiming he was hearing the music of the spheres. He was no longer a king. He was a ghost inhabiting a living body. In London, the political battle was over before it began. There was no debate this time. The king was clearly, undeniably, and permanently incapacitated. In February 1811, the Prince of Wales finally got what he had coveted for 3 decades. He was sworn in as Prince Regent. The Regency era, a time of dandyism, excess, and grand architecture, had begun. But while the Prince Regent was hosting lavish balls at Carlton House, his father was being moved to the north wing of Windsor Castle. The king was not sent to an asylum. He was too highborn for that. Instead, he was confined to a set of rooms in Windsor. The windows were modified, so he couldn't throw himself out. The furniture was padded. The man who had ruled the most powerful empire on earth was now restricted to a few hundred square feet of carpet. He grew a long, white, patriarchal beard. He wore a simple violet dressing gown. He wandered his rooms, talking to imaginary parliaments and holding court with the spirits of the past. He was a king in the long gallery, a legend, a bogeyman, and a tragedy all rolled into one. The king had lost his sight, his daughter, and his crown. But the cruelest part of the tragedy was yet to come. For the next 10 years, George III would live in total isolation, unaware that the world outside was changing, unaware that Napoleon had been defeated, and unaware that he was becoming a stranger to his own people. By February 1811, Great Britain was a kingdom with 2 heads. In London, at Carlton House, the Prince Regent was throwing the most expensive party in English history to celebrate his new powers. Thousands of guests marveled at a custom-made indoor river filled with real goldfish. Gold plate groaned under the weight of exotic meats, and the wine flowed like water. The first gentleman of Europe had finally arrived. But 20 miles away, in the north wing of Windsor Castle, the real king, the old king, was sitting on a wooden floor, surrounded by silence. He was no longer the centerpiece of the empire. He was its most guarded secret. The Regency Act had effectively buried George III while he was still breathing. What does a king do when he no longer knows he is king? While his son spent the nation's wealth on velvet and diamonds, George III was building an empire inside his own mind. He began to hold audiences with people who had been dead for 50 years. He handed out imaginary titles and signed invisible treaties. But was this truly madness, or had the king simply created a kinder reality to escape the torture of his physical blindness? The Prince of Wales, now the Prince Regent, did not hold back. For years, his father had restricted his spending and judged his morals. Now, the shackles were off. He spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a palace that looked like an Indian dreamscape. To the public, the contrast was jarring. They saw a bloated, self-indulgent regent who cared only for fashion and food, and they began a nostalgic for Farmer George. Even in his madness, the old king was more respected than the sane son. The prince knew this, and it fueled a bitter resentment that kept him from visiting the North Wing for months at a time. Inside the mansion, George III had entered a state of serene delusion. His blindness was now total, but in his mind, the lights were still on. He lived in a perpetual 1760, the year of his accession. He would spend hours talking to his favorite minister, Lord Bute, who had died in 1792. He didn't just mumble. He held complex, structured conversations. He would argue points of law, discuss the price of grain, and then suddenly break into a Handel aria, singing in a thin, wavering tenor. To the attendants watching him through the peepholes in the door, it was a haunting performance. The king was perfectly happy as long as his ghosts stayed with him. While the king lived in his fantasy, his physical body was governed by a strict medical committee. The Willis family had been largely replaced by more traditional royal doctors, but the treatment remained one of isolation. He was allowed to walk on a specific terrace at Windsor, but only at times when no one else could see him. He was kept in a suite of rooms where the carpets were removed to prevent him from tripping. His beard grew long and white, reaching down to his chest. He refused to be shaved, perhaps sensing that a razor in the hands of his captors was a threat. He looked less like a king and more like a biblical prophet lost in the wilderness. Queen Charlotte, the woman who had shared his bed for nearly half a century, could no longer bear to see him. The man in the North Wing was not her George. When she did visit, he often didn't recognize her, or worse. He would mistake her for a stranger and treat her with cold formality. The Queen's own health began to fail under the weight of the double life. She presided over the Prince Regent's court with a grim face, a woman mourning a husband who was still eating and drinking just a few halls away. The royal mansion had become a tomb with a living occupant. As the months turned into years, the public began to forget what the king looked like. He became a legend, a King Lear figure. People would stand outside the castle walls, looking up at the North Wing windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of a white-haired shadow. The Napoleonic Wars were reaching their bloody climax. The map of Europe was being redrawn. But for George III, the only map that mattered was the one he traced with his fingers on the walls of his room, a map of a kingdom that no longer existed, governed by a king who had been forgotten by time. The king was safe in his madness, but the world was about to remind him of its cruelty. In 1818, the last pillar of his old life, his queen, would leave him, and the king in his blind, silent world would have to face the ultimate isolation. By 1818, the royal mansion at Kew, once a place of summer retreats and family laughter, had become a house of mourning. Queen Charlotte, the woman who had stood by George III for 57 years, was dying. Her lungs were failing, and her heart was tired. For nearly a decade, she had lived a separate wing, terrified of her husband's outbursts yet anchored by his existence. But as the Queen's life ebbed away, a strange and cruel mercy took hold. The king, locked in his padded chambers at Windsor, had no idea. The woman who had birthed his 15 children and shared the burden of his crown was slipping into the void, and the man she loved was busy conducting an imaginary orchestra. What is a marriage when the memory of it only exists on one side? As Charlotte took her final breath, the Prince Regent wept at her bedside. But at Windsor, the king was laughing. He believed he was in heaven, speaking to angels. Was it a blessing that he didn't know he was now truly alone? Or was it the ultimate tragedy that the Queen died without a final goodbye from the only man she had ever called her own? In November 1818, Queen Charlotte died at Kew Palace. sitting in a black horsehair armchair. She was 74. Her relationship with the king in those final years had been one of affectionate distance. She had been his legal guardian, the one who ensured the doctors didn't overstep their bounds, even when she couldn't bring herself to look into his clouded eyes. The funeral was a grand, somber affair, but there was a gaping hole in the procession. The king was absent. To tell him of her death would have been an exercise in futility. When the doctors did attempt to break the news, the king simply looked through them. In his mind, Charlotte wasn't dead. She was merely in another room, or perhaps back in her childhood home in Mecklenburg-Strelitz. After Charlotte's death, the king's world shrank even further. He was now under the guardianship of his son, the Duke of York. The king's daily routine became a mechanical loop. He wore a violet-colored dressing gown, the color of mourning, but he didn't know who he was mourning for. He had grown a magnificent silver beard that flowed down to his waist. He looked like a figure out of a William Blake painting, a blind, ancient deity lost in a labyrinth. He spent his days at a harpsichord that had once belonged to Handel. Because he could no longer see the keys, he played by instinct, often composing haunting, dissonant melodies that drifted to the thick oak doors of his suite. The king's hallucinations became more structured and more frequent. He began to hold long, rambling conversations with his deceased daughter, Amelia. He would set a chair for her and describe the gardens of Windsor as they were 30 years ago. He also began to see his dead ministers. He would argue about the American War of Independence, defending his choices to ghosts. To the attendants, it was chilling to hear him say, "No, Mr. Grenville, the tax is just. The colonies must pay their share." He was a man fighting a war that had ended decades ago, in a country that had moved on without him. The porphyria, if that is indeed what it was, had ravaged his body. His legs were weak, and he often had to be carried to his bed. His digestion was a constant source of pain. Yet his heart was remarkably strong. He was in his 80s, an incredible age at the time, outliving almost all his contemporaries. The doctors noted that while his mind was gone, his physical constitution was like iron. He was a prisoner who refused to die. The Prince Regent, now an old man himself and suffering from gout and obesity, began to wonder if his father would outlive him. The waiting game for the throne had turned into a decades-long marathon. Outside the walls of Windsor, the world was entering the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines were beginning to puff across the landscape. The map of Europe had been redrawn at the Congress of Vienna. But George III remained in 1760. He was a forgotten king. Children born at the start of his madness were now adults with families of their own, and to them, George III was a myth. He was a face on the coins, but the man himself was a ghost. He was a living embodiment of a bygone era, kept in a gilded cage, waiting for the final curtain to fall. As the year 1819 drew to a close, a cold winter settled over England. In the North Wing, the king sat in the dark, his fingers tracing the carvings on his chair. He was the most isolated man in the world. But the new year, 1820, would bring the end of the tragedy. The farmer king was about to take his final walk, not in the gardens of Windsor, but into the pages of eternity. January 1820 was one of the coldest months England had seen in a century. The River Thames had frozen over, and a thick, gray frost clung to the battlements of Windsor Castle like a shroud. Inside the North Wing, the fires were kept roaring, but they couldn't warm the blood of the 81-year-old man who lay in the state bed. George III, the king who had reigned for 59 years, 3 months, and 2 days, the longest reigning male monarch in British history, was finally failing. The iron constitution that had withstood the poisoning of his blood and the mental storms of 4 decades was giving way. He was no longer talking to the ghosts of his ministers. He was no longer playing the harpsichord. He was entering the final, heavy silence of the body. Is there a moment of clarity before the end? For a man who lived in a fractured reality for 10 years, did the clouds part in those final hours? As the royal family gathered, not in love, but in duty, the Prince Regent was noticeably absent, struck down by his own illnesses. In the end, the most powerful man in the world died in the arms of a servant, while his kingdom prepared for a funeral they had been waiting for since 1788. What were the king's final words? And why did his death feel like the end of the world itself? The decline began on Christmas Day, 1819. The king lost his appetite. He, who had once been a man of vigorous walks and immense physical energy, could no longer sit up. His volubility turned into a low, incoherent mumble. The doctors, including Sir Henry Halford, realized that this wasn't another attack of the malady. This was the end. The king had become so thin that his violet dressing gown hung off his frame like a rag. His long white beard, once a symbol of his Lear-like tragedy, now rested on a chest that struggled for every breath. He was deaf, blind, and drifting in and out of consciousness. Yet, even in this state, he occasionally moved his hands as if he were still playing the organ, his fingers twitching to a silent only he could hear. While the king lay dying, tragedy struck the family again. His fourth son, the Duke of Kent, the father of the future Queen Victoria, died suddenly of pneumonia on January 23rd. The news was kept from the king. It wouldn't have mattered. He was already halfway across the threshold. The royal mansion was now a house of double mourning, with 2 royal corpses expected within a week. As the sun set over the frozen landscape of Windsor on Saturday, January 29th, the king's breathing became shallow. There was no dramatic speech, no final reconciliation with his estranged sons. At 35 minutes past 8 in the evening, the king simply stopped breathing. He died in the arms of his favorite attendant. The room was filled with the smell of candle wax and old parchment. The farmer king, the mad king, the architect of empire, was gone. The moment he died, the Duke of York, his second son, knelt by the bed and kissed his father's cold hand. Outside, the bells of St. George's Chapel began to toll, a deep rhythmic boom that announced the freezing town of Windsor that an era had ended. The news traveled fast to London. The Prince Regent, who had spent his life waiting for this moment, was himself so ill with pleurisy that he almost died the same week as his father. When he was told he was now King George IV, he reportedly broke into tears, not of grief, but of overwhelming stress. He had inherited a crown that was heavy with the legacy of a man the people loved far more than they loved him. In the days following his death, the king's body was prepared for a state funeral. Even in death, the tragedy followed him. The doctor performed a cursory autopsy, but the science of 1820 couldn't confirm the porphyria that modern science now suspects. They saw a brain that had shrunken and a heart that was enlarged. They saw the scars of the blisters on his legs. They saw the physical record of a man who had been tortured by both his biology and his physicians. He was laid in a lead coffin and then a mahogany one, covered in crimson velvet. The man who had been hidden in the north wing for a decade was finally brought out into the light, but he was under a pall of black silk. The funeral of George III was the largest Britain had ever seen. As the coffin was lowered into the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, the heralds broke their staves of office. The 18th century was officially buried with him. But as a heavy stone slab was slid into place, a new question arose. What would happen to the mansion? What secrets were left in the padded rooms of Windsor? And how would history judge the man who lost his mind but saved his dignity? On the night of February 16th, 1820, Windsor was not a town asleep. It was a town of fire and shadow. Thousands of torches flickered in the freezing wind, casting long, dancing silhouettes against the ancient stone walls of the castle. The old king was making his final journey. For 10 years, he had been a prisoner of the North Wing, a man the world had whispered about but never seen. Now, he was being carried through the gates, not as a patient, but as a titan of history. The funeral of George III was more than a burial. It was a closing of a chapter that had defined the British identity for 60 years. He had seen the birth of the United States, the rise and fall of Napoleon, and the dawn of the steam engine. As his coffin moved towards St. George's Chapel, the people of England realized they weren't just burying a king. They were burying the 18th century itself. What happens to a man's secrets when he is lowered into a hole in the ground? As the royal vault was opened, the air inside was thick with the dust of centuries of monarchs. But George III was different. He was a king who had lost his mind. And even in death, his body carried the evidence of the treatments that had failed him. Why did his son, the new King George IV, refuse to look at his father's face one last time? And what did the heralds discover when they broke their staves over the grave of a man who had outlived his own sanity? The funeral took place at night, a tradition for British monarchs that added a ghostly, ethereal quality to the proceedings. The coffin was massive, a double-layered vessel led in English oak, draped in a magnificent pall of black velvet emblazoned with the royal arms. Following the coffin was the new king's representative, the Duke of York. George IV, the man who had spent 40 years waiting for this moment, was too ill to attend. Some whisper it was gout. Others suggested it was a final, cowardly act of son who could not face the silent judgment of his father's corpse. The streets were lined with the first Life Guards, their swords reversed in a gesture of mourning, their plumed helmets dusted with a light falling of snow. The interior of the chapel was a sea of black. Every pillar was draped in sable cloth. Every candle was shielded to create a somber, dim atmosphere. The choir sang the funeral sentences of Purcell and Croft, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling, where the banners of the Knights of the Garter hung like frozen ghosts. As the service reached its climax, the Garter King of Arms stood over the open mouth of the royal vault. In a clear, ringing voice, he proclaimed the styles and titles of the deceased. The most high, most mighty, and most excellent monarch, George III. It took several minutes to list his honors. It was a stark reminder that despite the straitjackets and the padded rooms, this man had been the King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, and Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg. The most poignant moment of the ceremony was the breaking of the staves. The Lord Chamberlain and the Lord Steward stepped forward and snapped their white wands of office in half, dropping the pieces into the vault. This symbolized that their service to George III was ended forever. The coffin was then slowly lowered by a mechanical pulley into the darkness of the subterranean chamber. For those watching, it felt as though the ground was swallowing a piece of sun. The farmer king, who loved to lighten the soil, was now relegated to the cold, silent company of the Tudors and the Stuarts. As the mourners left the chapel, the post-mortem of George III's reign began in the London coffee houses. He was a man of contradictions. He was the king who lost America, yet he was also the king who founded the Royal Academy of Arts and obsessed over precision of clocks. He was a man of immense personal piety who had been struck down by a divine madness. The press, which had been cruel to him during his bouts of insanity, suddenly became nostalgic. The Times of London wrote that his private virtues had provided a moral compass to the nation during the chaos of the French Revolution. They began to call him Good Old George. The tragedy of his madness had, in a strange way, humanized the monarchy. He wasn't a distant god. He was a father, a husband, and a sufferer. Back at Windsor, the north wing was opened. The heavy curtains were pulled back, and the stale air of a decade was finally let out. The servants began the grim task of clearing out the king's mad rooms. They found the harpsichord with the worn keys, the violet dressing gowns, and the flute he used to play in the middle of the night. The Prince Regent, now George IV, immediately ordered a massive renovation. He wanted to erase the stain of his father's illness from the palace. He spent millions turning Windsor into a romantic, Gothic fortress. But no amount of gold leaf or new masonry could truly cover the echoes of the screams that had once filled those halls. The king was gone, but the malady was not. The blood of the Hanoverians flowed into the next generation. As George IV took the throne, the world watched closely. Would the new king inherit his father's stubbornness, or would he inherit the port wine poison that had turned the royal mansion into a prison? George III was a man of 15 children, a vast, sprawling dynasty intended to secure the British throne for centuries. He had been a father who obsessed over their education, their morals, and their health. But as the king's body was sealed in the royal vault, a silent terror began to creep through the hallways of the royal mansions. If the king's malady was in his blood, then it was in theirs, too. The madness wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a biological ticking time bomb. In the early 19th century, science didn't understand DNA, but they understood tainted blood. The world watched the king's sons, the royal dukes, with a microscopic intensity. Every eccentric habit, every outburst of temper, and every physical ailment was now viewed through the lens of the king's insanity. Can a crown be inherited without the curse that comes with it? George III's children were a collection of the brilliant, the debauched, and the deeply disturbed. As the new king, George IV, took the throne, he was already showing signs of the same volubility and skin sensitivities that had signaled his father's decline. But the real horror lay with the king's granddaughters and the generations to come. Was the madness of King George the hidden architect behind the tragedies of the Victorian era? George IV had spent his life mocking his father's madness. But as he aged, the similarities became undeniable. He suffered from massive bouts of gout, but he also experienced strange, vivid delusions. He famously claimed he had led a heavy dragoon charge at the Battle of Waterloo, a battle he never even attended. He became increasingly paranoid, barricading himself in the Royal Pavilion in Windsor, much like his father had been barricaded by his doctors. While he didn't succumb to full-blown port wine delirium of 1788, his erratic behavior and physical ailments suggest that the porphyria, the genetic ghost, was whispering in his ear until the day he died. The king's sixth son, Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, was perhaps the most intellectually gifted, but he was also the most physically fragile. He suffered from severe asthma and spasms that modern historians now link to the same metabolic disorder that plagued his father. The king's daughters, too, lived under the shadow. Princess Sophia, who lived a life of quiet scandal and isolation, was prone to nervous fits and stomach pains that mirrored the king's early symptoms. In the royal mansion, the phrase "a family flutter" became a coded way of describing a descent into the dark waters of the hereditary curse. For over a century, the king's madness was written off as a mental breakdown. But in the 1960s, psychiatrists Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter re-examined the medical records. They found a trail of dark urine and skin sensitivity throughout the Hanoverian line. They traced the symptoms back to Mary, Queen of Scots, and forward to the king's granddaughter, Princess Charlotte of Wales. When Charlotte died in childbirth in 1817, a death that devastated the nation, her symptoms included the same abdominal agony and delirium that her grandfather experienced at Kew. The madness wasn't just killing the king's mind, it was killing his descendants. The ghost didn't stop at the English Channel. Through the king's children and grandchildren, the suspected porphyria mutated and spread into the royal houses of Europe. There are lingering questions about the mental stability of several German princes, and even later members of the British royal family. The fear of the king's blood became a secret burden carried by Queen Victoria. Though she herself seemed spared the madness, she became a carrier of another genetic tragedy, hemophilia. It was as if the royal mansions were built on a foundation of biological instability, one generation fighting the mind, the next fighting the blood. After George III's death, the royal family went to great lengths to hide the details of his illness. They burned letters, they silenced doctors, and they rewrote the narrative to make him seem like a victim of overwork. They wanted to kill the ghost. But you cannot burn what is written in the bone. The royal mansion remained a place where the air felt heavy with the memory of the correction chair and the sound of a king talking to the dead. The children of George III lived in a golden cage, always looking in the mirror and wondering, is today the day the port wine shadow returns? The tragedy of King George III wasn't that he was mad. The tragedy was that he was the first to experience a poison that would haunt his family for a century. In our next part, we step away from the bloodline and into the laboratory to see how the madness of a king actually paved the way for modern psychiatry and the way we treat the human mind today. While George III was being restrained in the correction chair at Windsor, a revolution was quietly simmering outside the palace walls. For centuries, the mad were treated like animals, chained in damp cellars, whipped to beat the demons out of them, and put on display for a penny at Bethlehem Hospital, known as Bedlam. But when the most powerful man in the world lost his mind, the British establishment was forced to look at insanity through a different lens. If a king could go mad, then madness wasn't sin. It wasn't a lack of character. It was a disease. The royal mansion, with its padded rooms and elite doctors, became the world's most expensive laboratory. The tragedy of George III did what 1,000 years of science couldn't. It made the study of the mind a matter of national security. Did the torture of a king actually save the sanity of millions? Before George III, mad doctors were considered little more than jailers. But as the king's condition became a global headline, the field of psychiatry was dragged out of the Dark Ages and into the light of enlightenment. Why did the brutal methods of Dr. Francis Willis actually lead to the first laws protecting the mentally ill? And how did a king's port wine urine change the way we view the connection between the body and the brain forever? Dr. Francis Willis was a controversial figure. To the traditional royal physicians, he was a charlatan, but Willis brought a new philosophy to the royal mansion, moral management. He believed that the insane should not be broken by pain, but managed through a system of rewards and punishments. While we today see his use of the straitjacket as cruel, in 1788, it was seen as an alternative to iron chains. Willis treated the king like a disobedient child, rather than a possessed soul. This shift from punishing the devil to managing behavior was the first primitive step toward modern behavioral therapy. The royal mansion wasn't just a prison. It was the world's first high-profile psychiatric clinic. The king's repeated relapses in 1801 and 1804 kept the madness in the public eye. It created a sense of empathy that had never existed before. If good old George could suffer this way, what was happening to the poor in the gutters of London? In 1808, largely due to the awareness raised by the king's condition, Parliament passed the County Asylums Act. It encouraged the building of state-funded institutions for the pauper insane. For the first time in English history, the government took responsibility for the mental health of its citizens. The king's suffering had inadvertently opened the doors of the dark cells for thousands of his subjects. The king's case also sparked a massive debate about the seat of the soul. Traditionalists argued madness was purely mental, but the king's physical symptoms, the yellowing eyes, the abdominal pain, the skin rashes, suggested a biological cause. This led to the birth of neuropsychiatry. Doctors began to realize that the brain was an organ, just like the heart or the liver, and that physical diseases could manifest as mental delusions. When modern scientists identified porphyria as a likely culprit in the 1960s, it confirmed what the 18th century doctors had only guessed, that the mind and body are an inseparable loop. Before George III, anyone could open a private madhouse. There was no regulation, no oversight, and no training. But the high-stakes treatment of a monarch required a new level of professionalism. The doctors who treated the king, Willis, Bailey, Heberden, had to document every word, every meal, and every bowel movement. This level of clinical observation became the blueprint for modern medical records. The king's bulletins, published daily in the newspapers, taught the public the vocabulary of mental illness. Words like delirium, lucid interval, and convalescence entered the common tongue. The madness of King George destigmatized the conversation about mental health, moving it from the shadows of shame into the pages of science. Yet, for all the progress, the king's treatment remained a cautionary tale. It showed that even with the best doctors and the most money, the human mind remains a frontier. The royal malady proved that power is no shield against the biological glitches of the human condition. Narrator closes with solemn observation. The king died in 1820, but the science he sparked lived on. As the Victorian era dawned, the madhouses were being replaced by asylums, and mad doctors were becoming alienists, the precursors to modern psychiatrists. The king had lost his mind inside his royal mansion, but in doing so, he helped the world find a way to save others from the same darkness. History is usually written by the generals, the politicians, and the doctors. But the true story of what happened inside the royal mansion during the king's final decade, from 1810 to 1820, was witnessed by a different class of people altogether. These were the pages, the grooms of the bedchamber, and the apothecary's assistants. To the world, George III was a legend on a coin. To them, he was a man who needed his face washed, his food cut, and his hand held when the devils came in the night. The north wing of Windsor Castle was a world within a world. It had its own kitchen, its own laundry, and its own rules. Behind the thick oak doors, the etiquette of the British court died. There were no bows, no your majesties, and no velvet robes. There was only the raw, unfiltered reality of a human being stripped of his dignity by a disease that didn't care about his lineage. What does a servant do when the King of England mistakes them for a long-dead prime minister? For 10 years, a small rotation of men lived in total isolation with the king, sworn to a secrecy that was enforced by the threat of treason. They saw the farmer king eat with his hands. They heard him scream at invisible enemies, and they watched him cry for a daughter who had been in the ground for years. But they also saw something the doctors missed, a flickering spark of the old George, a man who, even in his deepest madness, tried to be kind to those who served him. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the pages were the king's closest companions. During his madness, their roles shifted from domestic help to psychiatric nurses. They were the ones who had to wrestle the king into the strait waistcoat when he became violent. They were the ones who bore the bruises from his flailing limbs. One servant, a man named Robert Batiscombe, kept private notes that survived the purge of the royal archives. He described the king's volubility as a physical force. The king would catch a servant by the buttonhole and talk for 6 hours straight about the price of wool in 1774. If the servant tried to leave, the king would weep. The isolation of the mansion wasn't just for the king, it was for the men trapped in the room with him. The servants reported a strange phenomenon that the public never knew. In the middle of the night, the blind king would often wake up convinced he was at a grand gala. He would command the orchestra, which consisted of empty chairs, to begin. He would then sit at his harpsichord and play for hours. The servants were required to stand at attention in the dark, sometimes for the entire night, pretending to be a silent audience of dukes and duchesses. They watched the king bow to the empty air, his white beard glowing in the candlelight, as he thanked the ghosts for their applause. It was a scene of haunting beauty and profound sadness that only the low-born were permitted to see. As the king's mind drifted further away, his sense of the physical world vanished. He often refused to be washed, fearing that the water was poisoned or that the towels were made of snakes. The servants had to develop elaborate ruses to keep the king clean. They would tell him he was preparing for a meeting with the King of Prussia to get him to put on a clean shirt. They also witnessed the physical manifestations of the porphyria that the doctors ignored. They saw the port wine stains on the bedsheets, the dark reddish-purple urine that indicated the king's blood was in a state of chemical war. They saw the king scratching at his skin until it bled, claiming that fire ants were crawling under his flesh. To the doctors, this was mania. To the servants who cleaned the wounds, it was a physical agony. Despite the violence and the delusions, the servants' accounts often mentioned the king's residual goodness. Even when he didn't know his own name, he would often stop his rambling to ask a page if he'd eaten or if his wife was well. He would share his bread with the birds that landed on his windowsill, calling them by the names of his dead siblings. There was a strange bond of shared exile. These men were cut off from their own families to serve a man who didn't know who they were. They became his eyes, describing the color of the sunset over the Windsor Great Park or the way the deer looked in the snow. In the secret rooms of the North Wing, the king wasn't a monarch or a madman. He was a grandfatherly figure in a violet dressing gown, lost in the storm. When the king finally died in 1820, the servants were the ones who felt the loss most acutely. The politicians were relieved. The Prince Regent was triumphant. But the men of the North Wing were suddenly unemployed and unmoored. They had spent 10 years living in a dream world with a king who was a ghost. As the new king ordered the rooms to be scrubbed with lye and the furniture to be burned, the servants carried the true story out with them in their heads. They knew that George III wasn't just a mad king. He was a man who, even when he lost his mind, never truly lost his heart. If you walk through the state apartments of Windsor Castle today, you will see a monument to the grandeur of the British monarchy. You will see the Waterloo Chamber, the Garter Throne Room, and the glittering treasures of the royal collection. But as the tourists snap their photos and the guards stand in their stiff, scarlet silence, there's a wing of the mansion that feels different. The air is heavier. The light seems to hit the oak paneling with a softer, more hesitant touch. This is the North Wing. To the casual observer, it is just another part of a massive fortress. But to those who know the history, it is the site of a 10-year disappearing act. It is the place where the most powerful man in the world was erased while he was still alive. Today, the madness of King George is a story told in books and movies, but in these hallways, the tragedy isn't a script, it's a haunting. Do buildings remember the trauma of their inhabitants? In the 200 years since George III took his final breath, Windsor has been renovated, bombed in wars, and nearly destroyed by a great fire in 1992. Yet, the legends of the white ghost of the North Wing persist among the staff. Why do the clocks in the king's former suite still require a specific, ancient rhythm to stay synchronized? And why did Queen Elizabeth II, a direct descendant of the Mad King, treat the history of this wing with such a unique, somber reverence? When George IV took the throne in 1820, he didn't just want to rule, he wanted to forget. He hired the architect Geoffrey Wyatville to transform the medieval castle into a romantic Gothic masterpiece. He spent the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of pounds to ensure that the shame of his father's illness was literally built over. The padded rooms were stripped. The correction chairs were moved to the Royal College of Physicians or destroyed. The windows that had been barred to prevent a royal suicide were replaced with elegant, pointed arches. But the layout of the North Wing remains a testament to isolation. The long, straight corridors were designed so that guards could see from one end to the other, ensuring the king could never escape the gaze of his protectors. One of the most frequent sightings of George III occurs in the Royal Library. Staff members over the decades have reported seeing an elderly man with a long white beard sitting in a chair, intently reading a book that isn't there. When approached, the figure vanishes. This isn't just a campfire story. George III was a man of immense intellect who amassed a collection of over 65,000 books, the foundation of the British Library. In his final years of blindness, he would often sit in the library and read with his fingers, tracing the spines of the books he could no longer see. The mansion, it seems, has held on to the image of a king who refused to let go of his love for knowledge, even when his mind had let go of him. On November 20th, 1992, a massive fire ripped through Windsor Castle. It started in the private chapel and spread rapidly through the staterooms. For a moment, it looked as though the entire history of the Georgian and Victorian eras would be turned to ash. When the smoke cleared and the restoration began, workers found hidden spaces behind the walls of the North Wing, vessels of the past that had been sealed up during George IV's renovations. They found old servant call bells and markings on the floorboards that matched the dimensions of the king's specialized furniture. The fire, in its destructive fury, peeled back the layers of gold leaf to reveal the bones of the madhouse that had existed within the palace. For a long time, the British royal family treated George III as a dark spot on the lineage. But in recent decades, that has changed. The opening of the Georgian Papers program by Queen Elizabeth II allowed historians to digitize thousands of the king's private letters and medical records. The modern royals have moved away from the madness narrative and toward one of medical tragedy. By embracing the truth of his porphyria or bipolar disorder, they have turned the North Wing from a site of shame into a site of empathy. The mansion is no longer a prison for a secret. It is a museum of man's resilience against a failing biology. Even today, late-night security guards at Windsor sometimes report hearing the faint, tinny sound of a harpsichord drifting through the ventilation shafts of the North Wing. There is no instrument in those rooms anymore, but the melody is always the same, a piece by Handel, the king's favorite composer. The royal mansion has survived for 1,000 years. It has seen kings crowned and kings executed. But the story of the man who lost his mind inside its walls remains its most human chapter. As we approach our final part, we look at the ultimate conclusion of this 15-part journey, how the Mad King finally found peace, and why his story is more relevant to us today than ever before. We have traveled through 15 chapters of a life that span the heights of imperial glory and the lowest depths of human degradation. We have walked the drafty corridors of Kew, felt the sting of the mad doctor's blisters, and stood in the silent, lightless rooms of the North Wing. The story of King George III is often filed away under tragedy or curiosity, a footnote about a man who lost a continent and then lost his mind. But as we stand back from the royal mansion and look at the full tapestry of his 81 years, a different picture emerges. This was not just a story of madness. It was a story of a man who fought a war against his own biology for 4 decades. And in the moments when he won, he changed the world. How do we measure a king? Is it by the lands he held or by the pain he endured? George III was the last monarch of the old world and the first of the new. He was a man who, despite being strapped to a chair, never lost his sense of duty to his people. As we close the heavy oak doors of this 15-part journey, we must ask, was he truly the Mad King, or was he the most resilient soul to ever wear the British crown? And why, in our modern age of mental health awareness, does his story matter more now than it did in 1820? For 2 centuries, The caricature of George III, the bumbling, foaming lunatic, was used to justify the American Revolution and the excesses of the Victorian era. But the 100,000 pages of his personal papers, recently made public, reveal a man of staggering diligence. He was a king who wrote detailed essays on agriculture, who mapped the transit of Venus, and who could identify every ship in the Royal Navy by name. The madness was an intruder, a thief that broke into his mind and stole his peace. When we look at his port wine urine and his neurological tremors through the lens porphyria, we see a patient, not a madman. We see a man who, in his lucid intervals, worked twice as hard to make up for the time the darkness had stolen. George III did something his predecessors never could. He made the monarchy moral. By remaining faithful to Queen Charlotte and focusing on the domestic happiness of his 15 children, he created the blueprint for the family monarchy that survives to this day. He moved the crown away from the battlefield and into the hearts of the middle class. He was the first king to be truly loved by his subjects, not out of fear, but out of a shared sense of Britishness. Even when he was blind and broken at Windsor, the people toasted to the king, God bless him, with a genuine tear in their eye. If the royal mansion could speak, it would tell us that George III's greatest victory wasn't over Napoleon. It was over himself. He survived treatments that would have killed a lesser man. He endured the death of his favorite children and the betrayal of his eldest son. And through it all, he maintained a shred of that golden silence, a dignity that even the straitjacket couldn't strip away. He was a king who lost his sight, but saw the future of an empire. He was a king who lost his mind, but helped the nation find its collective sanity. He was a man of the Enlightenment trapped in a medieval nightmare, and he walked through the fire with his head held as high as the restraints would allow. Today, the north wing of Windsor Castle is quiet. The correction chairs are gone and the Willis boys are forgotten. But the story of George III remains a powerful reminder that mental illness or biological madness does not define the value of a human life. We no longer hide the mad king in the shadows. We study him. We empathize with him. We recognize his port wine shadow as a struggle we all face in different ways. The struggle to remain ourselves when the world, or our own bodies, try to pull us apart. The farmer king has finally found his peace. He is no longer talking to the ghosts of 1776. He is no longer playing a silent harpsichord. He is home, and as the sun sets over the royal mansion, we leave him there, not as a tragedy, but as a triumph of the human spirit.